You know what my weapon of choice is, son?
Bowie knife?
You're right. And you know why? Because it can kill silently.
Rem says that authority and being well-read matter as much in philosophy as they do in science. He often acts as though his opponents have automatically lost due to them having read less than him. This is because Rem fails to see obvious differences between science and philosophy. In this video, I will explain why reading gets you further in science than it does in philosophy. There's much more disagreement in philosophy than in science. If you read a lot of philosophy, you end up with a bunch of inconsistent information. This is why people tend to read philosophy with more of a critical mindset than when reading science. When I open up a chemistry book, I'm not constantly met with stuff like, and here's what the other side has to say about this, because so much of it just isn't debated. A large part of philosophy consists of actually thinking about the subject matter. Rem places little, if any, importance on this crucial aspect of philosophy. Of course, ideally, someone studying science would be thinking critically about it as well. But the point is that it's not as important. You can just passively absorb scientific material and end up better off than you started. If you try that with philosophy, you'll turn into a clown like Rem, who holds multiple ridiculous and contradictory views. There are people I've met who've read way more philosophy than Rem, and yet I wouldn't take them more seriously than a level-headed person who has never studied philosophy. When you're being educated in science, the information you learn is largely consistent and reliable. It's information that is, in general, rationally arrived at. Even hipster anti-realists like Rem don't necessarily dispute this. Rem doesn't say that there's no point to studying science. For instance, he wouldn't say, we shouldn't do anything about global warming because that's just science, and science is bullshit. He would say that science doesn't correspond to reality, but he doesn't think anything corresponds to reality. He would still agree that science reaches whatever weaker notion of truth he holds. He would say something like, science is useful. On the other hand, philosophy is not consistent and therefore not reliable either. If science were really like philosophy, students would be taught multiple radically different alternatives to evolution, and there would be serious papers arguing that plants don't exist, or that the sun is a big light bulb. In philosophy, virtually everything is contested and all sorts of absurd views are put forward by experts. Rem might try to make an objection out of the fact that science changes. It's true that science isn't static, but science is inductive, so that's what one would expect if it were developing rationally. The fact that the scientific consensus changes doesn't mean the abandoned views were never justifiably believed. So, philosophical consensus is much harder to come by, but Rem is probably too ignorant to know anything about philosophical consensus anyway. Take a look at his friend Wittgenstein. This is someone Rem looks up to, and he thinks the idea that logic is objective isn't taken seriously. Rem undoubtedly holds similar views. Ask Yourself probably hasn't read much philosophy, yet it's hard to distinguish Rem from Ask Yourself in terms of philosophical competence. Just look at Rem's failed response to Name the Trait. In his discord, he rejects the proposition that views which affirm contradiction explode. He rejects it on the grounds that this is not true under all logics. In Name the Trait, he uses the principle of contradiction to argue against the carnist. He says that it is absurd for them to accept a conclusion that rejects veganism because it leads to an absurdity. Either Ask Yourself must accept the proposition that views which affirm contradiction explode, or he must abandon Name the Trait. If he finds Name the Trait persuasive, he must be adhering to classical logic, and therefore his reasoning in rejecting the first view regarding explosion is invalid. First of all, this isn't really a response to Name the Trait. It's an attempt to show an inconsistency between Name the Trait and Ask Yourself's position on logic. But one could just use this argument without adopting Ask Yourself's dumb views about logic. Secondly, Rem's argument doesn't work. As I pointed out, this is a bad argument. The principle of explosion and the law of non-contradiction are two different things. The fact that he accepts the law of non-contradiction doesn't mean he accepts classical logic as a whole. To which Rem replied, I've never said that it entails this. Reread what I've written. Someone needs to pry those squinty eyes open so he can read what he wrote. He said that Ask Yourself must be adhering to classical logic. He never explicitly says why, but the only thing that looks like an attempt to support this is when he says Ask Yourself uses the law of non-contradiction. If that's what he's saying, then my interpretation was right. If not, then he has given no reason for saying ask yourself must be adhering to classical logic, and I have no idea why he included that part about ask yourself accepting the law of non-contradiction. Lastly, Rem failed to spot ask yourself's obvious mistake. Ask yourself's reason for rejecting the principle of explosion is that it is not true under all logics. But this is a terrible reason, as I've pointed out in a previous blog post. Rem's hipster aura, scientific anti-realism, and the fact that he praises postmodernists and Thomas Kuhn might lead one to think he is at least somewhat skeptical of science. Yet he has no problem accepting science when it's furthest removed from observation and intelligibility. The least credible science is the cutting-edge theoretical physics stuff like string theory, or the idea that the universe is made of math. It's a stretch to even call such theories science. They aren't coherent, so they don't even meet the minimum requirements of a scientific claim, like having the potential to be justified empirically. Despite this, Rem has faith in the mathematical universe hypothesis, which he defends solely with an argument from authority.